Squid versus the Plushie Room by XyloneX. Personally, I've never had a bad experience on LSD. I was quite the psychonaut in my day. While the rest of my friends were approaching LSD with fear and reverence, I was jumping into that abyss feet first and looking to find the bottom of the rabbit hole. Whereas most of my friends have at least one story about a bad trip, I went looking for a bad trip there towards the end and could never even seem to find one. However, while my recollection of a night in 2008 is mostly positive, I cannot say the same for my buddy Squid. Squid had started out as my babysitter. From my first 10 strip to the end of my journey, he had always been very cautious about the drug itself. He told me stories of how he'd been dosed with roughly 200 UG without his knowledge or consent, and spent the better part of the day convinced he was losing his mind. I mean, I guess the experience could be overwhelming if you had no idea what was going on, but in a year of semi-regular use, I'd never seen a pink elephant or felt compelled to jump out of a window. Anyway, Squid started as my babysitter, but after the better part of a year, he started joining me at low doses. One night, we were divvying up a 10 strip, and he looked at me and said, "I think I'm ready, man." I cocked my head a little to the side, and he continued, "Give me the whole 10 strip, man." I laughed and said, "Sure, no problem, but you're giving me $100. He looked at me puzzled and said, "What? Why?" I laughed and said, "It's one thing if I'm gonna give you a little hit here and there, man, but if you drop the whole thing, I'll have to call Jeff and get my own." Squid fished $100 out of his pocket, and I texted Jeff saying, "Hey man, got any circus tickets?" An hour later, Squid and I were sitting on a sofa with a cooler at our feet. I had made sure we had a comfy place to sit, snacks, and plenty of juice. For the experiment that night, I was going to be loading up Halo Reach on the 360 and setting it up so the Saber could float endlessly through space during the Operation Uppercut mission, while we left a playlist of relaxing music running in the background. On my 60-inch flat screen in that dark living room, it was a pretty trippy experience even if you weren't on drugs. Even still, Squid looked at me and shoved the 10 strip into his mouth, saying, "Let's take a trip, brother." I nodded with that, and we started down the path that I knew all too well. 2 hours into the trip, Squid is sitting there, couch-locked, staring at the television like he's gazing into the eyes of some eldritch abomination. I'd say he was catatonic, but occasionally he'd jerk or contort and let out an incoherent scream. I, on the other hand, was texting Jeff and asking why he sold me a bunk strip. I was 2 hours in and feeling nothing. Usually, by this point, I'd feel at least a body buzz and have a head change. It didn't take me long to realize Squid was freaking out, so I tossed him over my shoulder and carried him into the Plushie Room. The Plushie Room was a small room in my basement that had a thick shag carpet and beanbags everywhere. We had set it up earlier in the year as a place to put friends who weren't handling trips very well. Squid was no exception. Pretty much the entire time I was carrying his skinny ass down there, he was kicking and screaming incoherently. That would have been a fun one to explain to the police. "Yes, officer, my friend and I are both intoxicated with 1500 UG of LSD, and I'm carrying him to a dimly lit room in my basement against his will." I was rather glad I lived outside of town. After dropping Squid off at the Plushie Room, I went back upstairs and I moved to my computer desk. I spent the next 2 to 3 hours working on a few grams of skunk weed that I had picked up along the way and playing random videos on albino black sheep, when I realized I had been unprepared for the experience I signed up for. The walls of reality collapsed into warm goo that oozed onto my skin like I was at the centerpiece of a planetary bukkake shower. I remember listening to a Mr. Bungle song, and from there, nothing I say could do anything to describe the experience accurately. For the next 6 or 7 hours, I was incapacitated. You ever had a dream where you're making decisions or acting under the presumption that preposterous things were just a matter of fact? When I came back to something that resembled reality, I had a startling realization. I didn't have a basement. The plushie room had been a meditation technique Squid used to calm me down if I got too excited during a trip. I looked over the sofa and sure enough, he was gone. I'd been down this road before. A few months prior, I found myself in a situation where I needed to sober up really quickly and be halfway functional. I started digging through my desk and looking for the Altoids tin I had set aside for an emergency kit for trips. A minute later, I was chewing Klonopin and crushing a wagon wheel of Adderall to send up my nose so I wouldn't pass out. For those of you who don't know, clonazepam makes short work of canceling out the effects of an acid trip. Within 30 minutes, I was lucid enough to go outside and spend the rest of the night looking for Squid. I had ended up calling over a few friends, and by morning we had made no headway towards finding him. By the following Sunday, his family had reported him missing. From pretty much that night, no one ever had heard from Squid again. After that, I pretty much swore off hallucinogens. While I had never had a bad trip per se, I had been so out of my head that I'd lost my best friend. About a month ago, I was scrolling through my news feed on Facebook when I saw they had identified skeletal remains believed to be Squid. My old house was demolished, and during the excavation, they found a skeleton roughly 10 feet below the concrete foundation. It was Squid. It's been about a month and I'm still baffled as to how he got down there, but part of me already knows. I carried Squid down the stairs and into the basement before tossing him into the plushie room. It didn't matter that the plushie room didn't exist. I was too detached from reality to notice what was going on. Well, as I sit here and stare into this 10 strip, I cannot help but wonder what I will find this evening when I head down there. I don't know what rests at the bottom of that rabbit hole, but I'm pretty sure I know why Squid was fighting so hard that night. Even if I don't, I will soon.